Hello, I'm Raider Pilot Steve and this is my review of the RAF Cosford Airshow 2026. I haven't been to this particular show since 2019, so it was good to be back and in the company of several friends. The lead up to the show was very exciting with REAP being cancelled, though it was rather disheartening when several weeks prior to the show, several star items dropped from the flying display, including the Flying Balls aerobatic team, the Sabre, Vampire, and 2 different Spitfire solo displays. Despite this, the organisers managed to get some excellent replacement items with very short notice. The main theme of the show was Engineering the Future, which had a strong focus on inspiring the next generation of STEM talent and showcasing the technology shaping the future Royal Air Force. Now, this theme was well catered for in the static display, especially the STEM hangars and to a certain degree in the flying display with the modern Air Force assets. But I do feel that this theme's a tad broad for the flying display to represent, and a more focused theme would be better. Don't get me wrong, inspiring the future men and women in the Royal Air Force is still an incredibly important task that must not be overlooked. The show also covered 2 major anniversaries of the 2026 season, the 80th anniversary of the Chipmunk and the 90th anniversary of the Spitfire. The weather on the day was quite hot, but with a pretty good breeze throughout the day. First, we'll take a look at the static display, starting with the airframes and active aircraft based at RAF Cosford. RAF Cosford isn't the most active airbase, and having such a short runway, it can't accommodate the more exciting aircraft types. However, it is home to the University of Birmingham Air Squadron, which flies the Grob G115E Tutor T1, which are used to fly air cadets for their first flying experiences. Several examples of the Tutor were on show throughout the showground and hangars. The bulk of the static aircraft on display came courtesy of the Defence College of Technical Training, who retain a large number of retired ex-military airframes for ground instruction purposes. And starting things off, and tucked away between 2 of the hangars, was a BAC Jet Provers T5A that was used by the Royal Air Force as a trainer from 1955 until 1993. It is now preserved at RAF Cosford and is used as a gate guard. There was also a total of 7 BAE Hawk T1As out on show. This type was once common on the airshow circuit and is now quite rare, with the exception of the jets of the Red Arrows. The 7 Hawks were divided up into various static areas. On one end of the showground was an impressive lineup of 4 ex-Royal Air Force Hawks in the classic black paint scheme. There was also 2 ex-Red Arrows Hawks dotted about, one outside among a static lineup and the other inside one of the hangars with its cockpit canopy removed. The final Hawk was on the other end of the showground and uniquely equipped with fuel tanks, which is quite a rare sight. One of the more advanced aircraft used for ground instruction was one of the Eurofighter Typhoon T1 development aircraft. This is DA4, the first 2-seater Typhoon to be built in the UK and the first Typhoon to be powered by the Eurojet EJ200 engines. This jet was retired in 2006 and spent a long time at the Imperial War Museum at Duxford, before moving to RAF Cosford in 2023. Also on show was several examples of one of Britain's greatest engineering marvels, the Harrier, also known as the Jump Jet. 2 ex-Royal Air Force Hawker Siddeley Harrier GR3s were out on display next to each other. One example from the Defence College of Technical Training and the other was brought out from the RAF Museum Midlands. The museum example actually flew during the Falklands War. A third example on show was an ex-Royal Navy BAE Sea Harrier FA2, which was actually the first FA2 built and not converted from the previous version, the FRS-1. Another iconic design on display was a pair of Panavia Tornadoes, which are now a very rare sight at UK air shows. The first example was an F3 variant, which was used as an all-weather interceptor fighter, which served with numbers 56 and 43 squadrons until it withdrew from active service in 2001. The second example was a GR1 Strike and Interdictor variant. This aircraft was the first British Tornado assigned to the Tri-National Tornado Training Establishment at RAF Cottesmore, where it served until it also retired from active service in 2001. Cosford is famous for the large number of Sepicat Jaguars it has preserved on site for the ground instruction role. Multiple examples of several variants were on show, including an impressive Jaguar line at the far end of the showground. Here are a few of the more distinctive examples that I saw at the show. A GR3A that served the Royal Air Force with number 54 Squadron based at RAF Coltishall, which was fully kitted out specially for the show. This looked very impressive. A GR3A which served with the Indian Air Force as well as various Royal Air Force squadrons during its active life, including numbers 54, 41 and 6 squadrons. During its time with number 54 Squadron, the aircraft took part in Operation Granby. It now wears the Desert Pink scheme used by aircraft during Operation Granby. T2 and a T2A, which are both beautifully painted in a glossy black cat paint scheme. Both of these aircraft were used by the Royal Air Force for operational training duties until they were withdrawn from active service in 1988 and 1999 respectively. T2A in a striking Raspberry Ripple scheme, which was the last British Jaguar built and didn't fly until 1982. This Jaguar was used as a trials aircraft for the Royal Aircraft Establishment and the Institute of Aviation Medicine. It would later be used for various duties with the Empire Test Pilot School until being retired in 2005. T2A in a standard grey scheme which served the Royal Air Force with number 226 Operational Conversion Unit and number 14 Squadron before being used as a trials aircraft from the Royal Aircraft Establishment and later Quinetic. She was retired in 2007 and still retains her Quinetic markings. And lastly, a T4 in a standard grey scheme which served the Royal Air Force with number 226 Operational Conversion Unit, numbers 54, 6 and 41 squadrons. It still has its tail painted like it was in 2018, one side marking the 100th anniversary of the Royal Air Force and the other side marking the 80th anniversary of RAF Cosford. Helicopter airframes were also well represented, starting with a Westland Gazelle HT2, which initially served in the Royal Navy before transferring to the Royal Air Force and becoming part of No. 2 Flight Training School, whose colours it still wears. Another rotary type on show was a pair of Westland Wessex HC2s, which are parked up next to each other. The first example is used by the Defence College of Technical Training and first flew in 1963 and was used for a variety of duties with the Royal Air Force and served with number 72 Squadron. It is currently painted in the iconic yellow search and rescue colours. The second example is owned by the RAF Museum Midlands and first flew in 1964 and served the Royal Air Force with number 72 Squadron. It would later be leased to the Sultan of Oman's Air Force for use during the Dhofar War in 1974. The RAF Museum Midlands also brought out some other airframes specially for the show this year. One of the most famous airframes out on show was the Boeing Chinook HC-6A known as Bravo November. This is the most famous Chinook in Royal Air Force service. Bravo November was only one of 4 Chinooks to survive the Falklands War in 1982, gaining it the nickname The Survivor. It would later be used during various conflicts that the UK was involved in, including the Iraq War and several deployments in Afghanistan. After nearly 40 years of active service, Bravo November retired in 2022 and is now on public display in the museum. A real piece of military aviation history that was great to see outside for a change. The museum also debuted 3 airframes that were being brought out for the first time under their new museum ownership. First was another ex-Red Arrows BAE Hawk T-1A, which was first delivered to the Royal Air Force in 1979 and was initially used for pilot training. In 1988, it was then transferred to the Royal Air Force aerobatic team, the Red Arrows, where it logged thousands of flight hours as a spare and display aircraft. It retired from display duties in 2011 and was flown into RAF Shawbury for storage, and in 2026 was officially catalogued as a museum exhibit and transferred to RAF Cosford. Next was a UK airshow debut. This was the General Atomics MQ-9A Reaper combat drone, which was delivered to the Royal Air Force in 2008 and was initially used for operations in Afghanistan. During its service life, it suffered damage from 2 separate crashes in 2008 and 2010. It later retired from active service in 2025 and will now be on permanent display at the museum. This was the first time a Reaper has ever appeared at a UK airshow. And last, but certainly not least, was a Westland Puma HC-2 transport helicopter, which was built in 1971 and would serve the Royal Air Force with various units including numbers 33, 230 and 28 squadrons, until being withdrawn from active service at the end of 2012. It will now be put on permanent display at the museum. There was also a number of visiting aircraft on static display at this year's show. Let us start with the military visitors. Surprisingly, there was very little static participation from the UK military air arms, but we did get a few. First was a Royal Air Force Grob G103A Viking TX-1 from No. 2 Flying Training School, based at RAF Syerston. The Army Air Corps also participated in the static display with one of their Boeing AH-64E Apache Guardian AH-2 attack helicopters. This helicopter is part of 662 Squadron under 3 Regiment and is based at Wattisham Flying Station. There was also a small number of international military visitors to the show, starting with the Belgian Air Force, who are celebrating their 80th anniversary this year. They brought over one of their Augusta A109 BAI utility helicopters, which is part of 17th Squadron under 1st Wing and is based at Bouverchain Air Base. This will probably be the final time one of these helicopters will appear at a UK show in Belgian hands, as the type is soon to be retired and replaced by the Airbus Helicopters H145M. The Irish Air Corps also participated in the show with one of their Pilatus PC-12NG Spectre aircraft, which looked very smart in its dark grey scheme. This is Ireland's most recent I-Star platform, which covers a variety of duties including intelligence gathering, surveillance, target acquisition and reconnaissance. This aircraft is part of 104 Squadron, which is part of No. 1 Operations Wing, which is based at Casement Aerodrome. But it was the Royal Netherlands Air and Space Force that were the stars of the static display. First up was their Boeing AH-64E Apache Guardian attack helicopter, which was making only its second UK appearance after debuting at the Royal International Air Tattoo last year. This helicopter is part of Defence Helicopter Command, which is based at Gilsrijen Air Base and serves with 301 Squadron. The other aircraft they provided was a Lockheed C-130H-30 Hercules transport aircraft, which is part of Air Mobility Command and based at Eindhoven Air Base and is part of 336 Squadron. This is the first time a Dutch Hercules has taken part in a UK airshow since 2019 and was a firm crowd favourite as it was opened up for the public to walk through Also note the disco ball hanging at the back of the aircraft. Before we take a look at some of the other post-war aircraft on static display, let's take a look at the impressive gathering of de Havilland Chipmunks to celebrate the type's 80th anniversary. A total of 10 examples made up the Chippy line, and here is a little bit about each aircraft. First is probably the most famous chipmunk in the UK. This is the T-10 owned by the Henlow Chipmunk Group, which was actually used to teach various members of the royal family to fly, including King Charles III, and still retained its unique flashing beacon. Next was a T-10 operated by the Navy Wing's Heritage Flight, which started its service life with the Royal Air Force in 1952 and later joined the Royal Navy in 1966. It is still used to give heritage pilots experience on tail draggers and is still painted in Royal Navy colours. Another T-10, which spent its life with the Royal Air Force for the training role before being sold into private hands in 1996. This chipmunk is often used by the de Havilland Educational Trust at various events and air shows. A T-10 that also spent its life with the Royal Air Force for training purposes and was sold into private hands in 1974. It currently wears an authentic grey Royal Air Force training scheme. A very rare Canadian-built DHC-1 or Chipmunk T1, which was one of 3 pre-production aircraft sent to the UK for evaluation and to help kick-start British production of the type. It is recognised as the oldest airworthy chipmunk in the world and was the 11th chipmunk to be built in 1946. Next was a Mark 22 from the Airways Flying Club, which initially served with the Army Air Corps and was based at Middle Wallop. It now wears a very nice British Overseas Airways Corporation scheme, complete with the Speedbird logo on the tail. Back to the T-10s, with this example operated by Airborne Classics Limited, which also served the Army Air Corps at Middle Wallop. This was one of 2 chipmunks painted in full camouflage for duties as a forward air controller and are sometimes referred to as Spitmunks. A single example of a Portuguese-built aircraft, the Ogma DHC-1 Chipmunk T20, which served in the Portuguese Air Force until it was imported to the UK. It is owned by Philip Glenn Winterbottom and still retains authentic Portuguese Air Force markings. A T-10, owned by Neb Gardner, which started life with the Royal Air Force where it was used extensively for cadet training at RAF Cranwell. It now wears the classic silver Royal Air Force training scheme. Lastly was a T-10, which flew with the Royal Air Force until it was retired in 1997. It is now owned by Alan Bryan Ascroft and wears Army Air Corps colours. Although not part of the Chippy line, we did get an additional static chipmunk on the morning of the show. Arriving at the tail end of the arrivals was one of the de Havilland Chipmunk T-10s from the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, which are still used today for tail dragger training. This was an incredibly rare appearance at an air show, and I haven't seen one of the flight's chipmunks since 2021. It was parked up on the main flight line until it departed later on during the flying programme. Now, on to the other post-war types that are out on display. There was a pair of high-wing monoplanes connected to the British aircraft manufacturer Auster Aircraft Limited. First was an Auster AOP-9, which was built for the British Army as a light observation aircraft and still wears an Army Air Corps scheme. Nearby was a Beagle A61 Terrier II, which is a development of the earlier Taylorcraft Auster for use as a light transport aircraft for private pilots. As well as the BAC Jet Provost mentioned earlier, there was another example of the classic jet. This was a T-52, which is a light ground attack variant of the T-4 trainer. This particular aircraft was built for the South Arabian Air Force, which later became South Yemen. It would suffer some minor combat damage when taking part in an operational sortie during its service. In 1975, it was transferred to the Republic of Singapore Air Force until it was replaced by the Strike Master in 1980. This jet Provost is the only airworthy T-52 in the world, and now operated by Swords Aviation, and now wears its original South Arabian markings. Next was an unannounced addition to the static lineup, the Cessna 01E Bird Dog observation aircraft. This example was built in 1957 and sent straight to the French Army, where it would be operated in Algeria. It would be struck off from French service in 1988 and eventually be imported to the UK, where it is now owned by Rebecca Anna Daly and based at Old Warden Aerodrome. This aircraft wears the colours of the Republic of Vietnam Air Force and pays tribute to an aircraft flown by Major Lai Bung, who fled Vietnam with his family during the fall of Saigon and landed the aircraft on the deck of the USS Midway. Former training aircraft of the Royal Air Force were also out on display at different parts of the showground. This came in the form of a pair of Scottish Aviation Bulldog T1s, one in the more common and conventional red and white paint scheme, whilst the other wore the far more striking black and yellow colours. The last helicopter on static display was this lovely Westland Scout AH-1 in classic Army Air Corps camouflage. This particular helicopter is not an airworthy example and thus arrived by road, but can be run on the ground and looked pretty good with the dummy weapons applied to its sponsons. Now let's take a look at the small collection of warbirds that were out on display. First was the largest warbird in the static park, the Canadian Vickers PBV-1A Canzo A, owned by Plain Sailing. This aircraft is a Canadian license-built version of the consolidated PBY-5A Catalina, and she carries the nose art of Miss Pickup. The original Miss Pickup was a United States Army Air Force Catalina from the 5th Emergency Rescue Squadron, which became famous for carrying out air-sea rescue taskings in the North Sea in 1945. One of the static highlights of the show was the Supermarine Spitfire F9, owned by Mark Bennett, which wears a distinctive desert camouflage paint scheme. This Spitfire saw service in Malta and Sicily during the Second World War and would later be operated by the Free French Forces. This is the world's only airworthy Spitfire that is powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin 63 engine. This was also the sole representation of the 90th anniversary of the Supermarine Spitfire in the static display. Another fighter on the show was Bob Davies' Yakovlev Yak 3UPW replica, which was built in the 1990s in Romania. Although not being a traditional warbird, this aircraft is incredibly well built and is painted as White 27 in honour of Soviet ace Ivan Kozydov. The aircraft also wears Ukrainian markings instead of the usual Russian red stars to show solidarity with Ukraine, which was invaded by Russia in 2022. The remaining 3 warbirds on display were all vintage American training aircraft. First was a beautiful example of a Boeing Stearman PT-17 Cadet. The specific military history of this aircraft is unknown, but it saw military service before going into private hands after the Second World War. This aircraft is now based at Brayton Airfield and is known as the Yorkshire Yankee and is painted in a very smart United States Army Air Corps scheme. Nearby was Kennett Aviation's North American AT-60 Harvard 3, which took the place of the Navy Wing's Heritage Flight Harvard, which is still undergoing maintenance. This Harvard is usually based at Old Warden Aerodrome, but has been leased out to Navy Wings for tail dragger training. It is painted in the United States Army Air Force colours. The final warbird was a Piper L4H Grasshopper, which is painted in the United States Army Air Force colours, including invasion stripes. This aircraft was actually flown into the show from Wycombe Air Park by 19-year-old aviator Amelia Richardson. Now on to the last bits of static, with some of the general aviation types, which included a few gliders. The Halton Aero Club provided two of their aircraft, a Piper PA-28-161 Warrior II and a Rhymes F-152. The enthusiast area featured a French-registered American General AG-5B Tiger and Paul Gibbs's tipsy T-66 Nipper Mark III, which was visiting Cosford for the first time. The hangars also housed a few light aircraft types, including a Best of Ninja and a RANS S6ES Coyote II. Gliders were also on show, including a Skemp Herf Duo Discus from the RAF Shawbury Gliding Club and the ex-Royal Air Force Slingsby T-61F Venture T2 motor glider, which was parked between two of the hangars. Now we move on to the main event, the flying display. The RAF Cosford Airshow is most often opened by the Royal Air Force Falcons Parachute Display Team, and this year was no exception. The team put on their low show due to the cloud base, and only for the second time ever they used one of the Royal Air Force's Airbus A400M Atlas C-1 transport aircraft as their jump ship. Both the team and the Atlas are based at RAF Brize Norton and are part of the Airborne Delivery Wing and No. 70 Squadron respectively. Once the team had descended and gathered for the final salute, the Atlas performed a single flypast. Incidentally, the 2026 season also marked 65 years since the RAF Falcons were formed. Next up was the first of two frontline jets from the Royal Air Force. Coming in from RAF Marham and part of No. 617 Squadron was the Lockheed Martin F-35B Lightning II, which gave two passes. First, a fast pass with some nice afterburner, followed by a slow hover pass. Historic Royal Air Force types were also represented in the flying display by the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. They brought over a pair of their fighters in the form of the Hawker Hurricane Mark II-C and the Supermarine Spitfire LF-5B. The Hurricane currently wears a night fighter scheme of an aircraft from No. 247 Squadron, whilst the Spitfire is wearing an authentic D-Day markings that it wore in 1944 while serving with No. 402 City of Winnipeg Squadron with the Royal Canadian Air Force. The pair flew a series of formation passes before performing their own solo displays. Unfortunately, the Douglas DC-3C Dakota III was unable to appear due to technical problems. We then changed pace completely, with Rich Goodwin in his highly modified Pitts S2SE Special. The Jet Pitts have been unable to perform at Cosford in the past due to insurance issues, but this year saw it make its first flying display appearance at the show. Rich put the Pitts through an incredible aerobatic routine, with plenty of jet noise from the pair of ATM Lynx turbines. The British Army were also present for the flying programme, with the Army Air Corps display team, who are making their Cosford debut this year. The team consisted of a pair of Boeing AH-64E Apache Guardian AH-2s and a single Leonardo AW-159 Wildcat AH-1. Rather than a tactical demonstration like last year, the team put on a more dynamic display which showcased the helicopter's incredible manoeuvrability. The team also adopted the Blue Eagles name and used the call signs Eagles 1, 2 and 3. The Blue Eagles display team operated from 1968 until 2010 with a variety of helicopters, but most famously with the Lynx and Gazelle. Further aerobatics were performed by the Schleicher Ask-21 glider from the RAF Shawbury Gliding Club, which was towed up earlier by a Scribe SF-25C Falk. What made this display quite special was that it was piloted by Air Recruit Bradley Lefty Kemp from No. 1 School of Technical Training, who was making his first public flying display, a truly remarkable achievement. Moving on to the other frontline jet of the Royal Air Force, the Eurofighter Typhoon FGR-4. The jet is part of No. 29 Squadron at RAF Coningsby and was put through its paces by Flight Lieutenant Tom Nation. Admittedly, I found this demonstration quite distant and lacking the noisy impact that previous display seasons had. Nonetheless, it was great to finally see my first Typhoon display since last year. Next up was one of the international military visitors. This came courtesy of the Royal Canadian Air Force with one of their Lockheed Martin CC-130J Hercules from 436 Transport Squadron at Canadian Forces Base Trenton. This Hercules is currently on deployment with Canada's Air Task Force at Prestwick Airport in Scotland. The iconic turboprop transport performed 3 flypasts before departing back to base. The good weather this year allowed the participation of the Great War Display Team with their combination of various replicas to represent aerial combat from the First World War. This year saw 6 aircraft, including a Nieuport 17 replica, a pair of Fokker DR-1 replicas, and a trio of SE-5A replicas consisting of a Slingsby T-56 and 2 replica plans SE-5As. The team performed various tail chases with each of the aircraft pairing off, which was further enhanced with some aerial pyrotechnics before the team performed a final flypast to mark the end of their demonstration. Now we move on to 3 of the most iconic American warbirds, which kicked off their segment with a loose formation pass before they performed their own solo displays. First of the 3 was the Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress Sally B, which is a frequent visitor to Cosford, but for the first time ever, it operated out of Cosford. It was quite the sight to see such a big bomber taking off and landing on Cosford's relatively short runway. Coming in after the bomber had landed was the 2 fighters from Fighter Aviation Engineering Limited, the CAC C-18 Mustang Mark 21 Jersey Jerk, and the Republic P-47D Thunderbolt Nellie B, making only their second appearance at Cosford after debuting last year. After a formation pass, the 2 fighters performed their own consecutive solo displays. Moving on to another international visitor, and undoubtedly the display most people were looking forward to, the French Air and Space Forces Dassault Rafale C. This multi-role jet is part of Escadron de Transformation Rafale 3-4 and based at BA 113 Saint Dizier Air Base, and is painted in a very striking and very French paint scheme for the display season. Captain Alexandre Rocky Roque really put the Rafale through its paces with all sorts of incredible manoeuvres with plenty of afterburner. It honestly knocked the socks off the Typhoon display. The French Rafale solo display is regarded as one of the best fast jet demonstrations in the world, and this display proved this without any doubt. Following the noisy Rafale was a much quieter but very spirited display by the vintage pair, who fly a pair of the Havilland Canada Chipmunk T10s and helped further celebrate the 80th anniversary of the type. What makes the vintage pair stand out is that they perform a full aerobatic display with their Chipmunks, which they did at Cosford for the first time last year. The pilots, David Petters and John Higgins, really put on a very special display, and I look forward to seeing them again in the future. It wouldn't be Cosford without an appearance by the Royal Air Force aerobatic team, the Red Arrows, and this would be the team's last display in the UK for a while, due to an upcoming tour in the United States of America to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the United States Declaration of Independence. The team were reduced to 7 aircraft for the 2026 season in order to preserve the ageing BAE Hawk T-1As, which are slated for retirement in 2030, although a replacement has not yet been confirmed at the time of writing. Despite the reduced number of aircraft and thus a somewhat shorter display time, the team put on a very entertaining routine, including a number of manoeuvres not seen in a long time, with the overhead departure being a particular highlight. One of the more unusual shapes in the flying display was the North American Rockwell OV-10B Bronco, operated by the Bronco demo team. The twin-boom aircraft was flown by Tony de Bruin, who gave a great demonstration of its manoeuvrability and its short takeoff and landing capabilities. Next came the only classic jet of the show, the iconic BAC Jet Brothers T5 from Viper Classic Aircraft, which was operated out of Cosford. Pilot Ian Brett put on a very entertaining aerobatic routine in now very blue skies. This particular Jet Brothers once flew with the Swords display team in 1974 and currently wears authentic No. 6 Flying Training School colours, representing its time at RAF Finningley. Coming in low and slow was another one of the Royal Air Force heavies, the Boeing C-17A Globemaster III from No. 99 Squadron based at Brize Norton. This year also saw the 25th anniversary of the C-17 in Royal Air Force service, and the aircraft we saw had a specially painted tail to mark the occasion. This wasn't the last time we would see this aircraft at the show. Training aircraft was the main focus for the next few displays, starting with a rare airshow outing for the Rolls-Royce Heritage Flight's Nordin AT-16 Harvard 2B, which performed a lovely routine. This Harvard actually holds the record for the longest-serving military aircraft in the UK, having served for 72 years before retiring in 2016. Although it is no longer used for basic training by the Royal Air Force, the Grob G115E Tutor T1 is still used by university air squadrons to give RAF cadets their first taste of flying. Flight Lieutenant Rich Tamala flew the Tutor in a very elegant aerobatic display. Once the Tutor had landed, the Boeing C-17A Globemaster III came back for a second, much faster flypast, which concluded with an impressive climb out of the circuit. It was now the turn of the Royal Navy to take centre stage, with a special display combining the past and the present. Starting with a very impressive formation takeoff was the Navy Wings Heritage Flight's Fairy Swordfish Mark I, alongside the Royal Navy helicopter display team, the Black Cats, from 825 Naval Air Squadron, which are flying a single Leonardo AW159 Wildcat HMA-2 for the 2026 season. After a series of formation passes and a very close break at crowd centre, the pair put on their own solo displays, with the Swordfish really being thrown around and a very good demonstration of the Wildcat's manoeuvrability. This display also paid tribute to the 3 Royal Navy personnel who were killed when their Merlin helicopter crashed during a training exercise. Their names were Lieutenant Commander Chris Gayson, Lieutenant Lily Mae Fisher, and Petty Officer Owen Green. As we neared the end of the flying display, it was time for some more warbird action. First was one of the most anticipated visiting displays, the Avro Anson Mark I, operated by RAF Station Czechoslovakia, which was making its first visit to Cosford. The weather conditions were absolutely perfect for this aircraft, which put on a surprisingly dynamic and energetic display, which was further enhanced by the very effective smoke system. The Anson crew also wore authentic uniforms for the era, which can't have been comfortable in the heat. This beautifully restored aircraft is the world's only Anson Mark I that is airworthy, and is painted to represent K6183, the first Royal Air Force aircraft to be lost in combat during World War II in 1939. This display was honestly one of the finest warbird demonstrations I have ever seen. Next, we had the 2 penultimate displays of the day, which came courtesy of the Duxford-based Aircraft Restoration Company, which were added mere days prior to the show. First up was another Cosford debut with the Westland Lysander Mark III, which is a rather unique looking aircraft with its unusual wings, landing gear and external bomb racks. The Lysander was put through a very polished display by pilot Mike Collett, who was making his debut on the type. Following the Lysander was the Hispano Buchon, a Spanish-built version of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 G2 powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Usually, this aircraft plays the role of an enemy aircraft that is then chased off by various Allied fighters, but at Cosford it got to show off its solo display potential in the hands of John Gowdy. Now, on to the finale of the show, which came courtesy of the Royal Air Force with the Boeing Chinook HC-6A. The heavy lift helicopter is part of No. 18 Squadron based at RAF Odium, and earlier had departed to collect some equipment for the demonstration. The display first showcased the Chinook's ability to carry underslung loads, which in this case consisted of a howitzer artillery gun and a Pinzgauer utility vehicle. Upon dropping off the load, the helicopter landed to drop off ground troops and a quad bike, before taking off and demonstrating the incredible manoeuvrability it possesses. Meanwhile, the ground troops prepped the howitzer for firing, which it did 3 times before being hooked up to the Pinzgauer and towed away. The Chinook then performed some further manoeuvres before bowing to the crowds to conclude the demonstration. This was an incredible demonstration and, in my view, the best that the Chinook Roll demonstration team has performed. This display resulted in the team being presented the Bill Hartree Memorial Trophy for the best display. Overall, the RAF Cosford Airshow 2026 was absolutely amazing. A great show with some great friends and some incredible aircraft on show. Now, this year's show might have suffered some setbacks with quite a few cancellations and maybe not having as many international military visitors as some people may want. But the show massively delivered on some top quality flying displays throughout the day. So many, in fact, narrowing down my favourites is quite the task. In my view, the top displays of the day was the French Air and Space Force's Dassault Rafale C, RAF Station Czechoslovakia's Avro Anson Mark I, and the Royal Air Force Boeing Chinook HC-6A. I also really enjoyed seeing the Boeing B-17G Flying Fortress Sally B operating from Cosford, as well as the Royal Navy tribute featuring the Fairy Swordfish Mark I and the Black Cats helicopter display team. If you wish to see more of my photos from this event and others, I have linked my Flickr page in the description below. You may also wish to follow me on Instagram, where I post aviation content frequently. My next major show will be both days of the Shuttleworth Festival of Flight. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you did, and I hope you will join me in the next one. Bye!